with today. All things were created through him and for him. Colossians 1:16. It is passages and verses like that in the Bible that are the reason why we do stuff like this. Like, let's talk. All things are created through Christ and for Christ. So if you have the modern cultural assumption that the Bible only applies to certain spiritual activities like church or prayer or salvation, but nothing else, then you'll choke on passages like this. Passages like this won't make sense. Everything in your existence that you have ever encountered, experienced, used, talked to, felt, thought, all of it has one purpose. It's for Christ. The Bible actually even teaches that the things as small as eating and drinking food, 1 Corinthians 10:31 says that we are to do to the glory of God. This means that from the dust that's stuck to the bottom of your shoes right now to the asteroids floating up in the Milky Way, and everything in between has a purpose. And there is never a time in your life where Christ must not be the center and the point of it. Now, that means that we have to recalibrate our minds from what we typically think of when we think of Christianity or spiritual things or the Bible. And that's what we're going to do today. That's why we do these things. All things were created through him and for him. One of the things created, obviously, no shocker on what we're talking about tonight, is sex. Now, sex is weird for Christians to talk about. Because from the world, we hear that essentially we need to be having about as much sex as possible. But then we come to church, and the entire way we hear sex talked about is almost only negative. Sex is almost only ever talked about as a sinful, bad thing, or something that ruins people's lives. They handle it wrongly. Now, that's confusing. And what it looks like at the face value of it is that the world has a really high view of sex. It thinks it's a good thing, while we Christians have a very low view of sex. We don't think it's that great. Now, Colossians 1 tells us clearly, God made sex. Sex was not the devil's idea. God didn't stumble on Adam and Eve and say, like, whoa, no, don't do that. God created sex, and he made it for it to be received and enjoyed. In fact, we read in Genesis 2, God officiating the very first wedding between Adam and Eve, and here's what he says. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. If you're familiar with the King James Version, it says cleave to his wife. And that has sexual connotations to it. Well, hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. It's kind of hard to avoid, right? God made sex. Now, what we could do is we could say, look, here's God's plan for sex. One man, one woman, in marriage, nothing else. And that would be right. And that is right and true and good. And we could stop there and say, sermon's over. That's what sex is. Don't do anything else outside of that, okay? We could, but that would be a boring sermon. And it wouldn't get at the heart of the why. Because see, God didn't only make sex, but God made sex for Christ. All things were created through him and for him. So for you to be a biblically faithful Christian, you have to ask yourself, in whatever you're dealing with, how is this for Christ, including sex? So God made sex, and sex is about God. Now, before we get going any further, I want to just make a clear definition of what we're talking about with sex. So here's my definition. I got this from a book written by doctors. It's not a Christian book, but I'll talk about it later. Here's their definition. Any intimate contact that involves arousal, stimulation, and or a response. Read that one more time for you, okay? Any intimate contact that involves arousal, stimulation, and or a response. Now, why am I giving you a definition of sex? Most of you go to public school. Most of you are probably fairly aware of what sex is. Well, here's why I'm doing this. My purpose giving this definition is so that no one in this room gets the idea that sex only means intercourse. And that as long as we don't do that one thing, we're not having sex and it's okay. That's not true, friends. Any intimate contact. So, I don't think it would be helpful nor wise to make a long list of different sexual acts that count as this, but I think it's pretty clear to us that when we begin an act, whether by ourselves or with another person, that is headed in the direction with the purpose of sexual stimulation, we know what we're doing. So while you might be able to convince me that it's okay for you to give a quick kiss to your girlfriend, I'm going to have a really hard time you convincing me that it's okay for you to make out with your girlfriend for 45 minutes and you not become sexually aroused. If that's true, then there's probably deeper issues we're going to need to talk about for some reason. Because okay, all right, I'll stop there. Ephesians 5:3 defines the Christian sexual ethic as this. Ephesians 5:3 says that there should not be a hint of porneia named among Christians. Porneia is our word that we translate into the English as sexual immorality. If it sounds familiar to you, it's where we get our word pornography from. Porn being explicit, perverse sexual content, and graphic, a visual display of it. Porneia is this Greek term, it's a junk drawer term, that it just means any kind of sexual stimulation or act outside of God's design. So whether that is you browsing stuff on Instagram that maybe people wouldn't classify as porn, or that's you talking to a girl in a certain way, or you getting all sorts of different sexual acts done, or just having sex. Sexual immorality, Paul is saying that there can't even be a whiff of it. That's the Christian sexual ethic. Okay. Now, the text that we're looking at tonight to jump into this is in 1 Corinthians. And 1 Corinthians is a very interesting book, because it's a letter written by Paul to a young urban church in the city of Corinth. And Paul is writing to the Corinthian church in response to a letter that they've actually written to him. Paul went to Corinth and he started this church, stayed there for a little over a year, and then he left. And then quickly all sorts of stuff kind of fell apart, which that typically happens because we're all Christians we're all sinners. Those Christians, it's crazy, you can't trust them. We're all sinners, and so we sin, we do stupid stuff. So they write to Paul asking him a bunch of questions. And a lot of them involve what to do about sex and sexuality, what we do with our bodies. That's the passage we're going to look at tonight. It's 1 Corinthians 6, 12 through 20. And we're just going to move through it verse at a time. We're not going to be able to look at everything in the passage, but we're going to look at some really key points, okay? So our overview of the night is going to be, we're going to look at the limits of sex, the purpose of sex, the power of sex, and the glory of sex. The limits, the purpose, the power, and the glory. So let's start with the limits. Paul immediately, he brings up a quote that was in the letter that the Corinthians wrote to him. And you see this all over the book of Corinthians. And here's the first quote. All things are lawful for me. I think in the NIV they translate that as all things are permissible, or I can do anything. This is a popular saying that the Corinthians are teaching, and what they're doing is they're taking Paul's teaching, his right teaching on Christ's fulfillment of the law, and they're doing what so many people across church history have done. They're taking what Christ has done, and they're saying, oh, Christ fulfilled the law? Christ forgave my sin? Awesome. So you're saying I have a credit card now with no limit, and I can just go out and sin as much as I want? Wonderful. And they then view what Christ has done as an ability to just do whatever they want, which happens all the time today. Now, Paul, he's horrified at this, and some of the sexual acts they're doing are perverse and crazy, and he immediately pushes back with this admonition. Here's what he says. Okay, maybe you think all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful, and I will not be dominated by anything. So Paul, in pushing back on what these Corinthians think freedom is, he says, no. there are two bumpers. And just for simplicity's sake, we're going to say that those bumpers are love and Lord. Love and Lord. Now, I'm going to move through these really quickly. And so if you want to know more about this, you can ask in the Q&A. The word for helpful is a word, it's a plural word, and it's talking about what's beneficial to a community. And Paul is saying that we can never let anything we do under the guise of Christian freedom be something that is destructive overall to society or to our neighbors. So before we do anything, especially sexually, we have to ask ourselves, how will this affect other people? How will this affect my future wife, my future children, the people who look up to me, my family, my church, ultimately the kingdom of God? We can never, there is a sneaking thing about sexual sin particularly, that we think we can keep it hidden. And if we keep it hidden and nobody else knows about it, then there'll be no consequences. And Paul just says, no, look, your sin will be found out. We have to always think about what's loving. Secondly, we have to think about lordship. What is lordship? Paul makes it clear that we should be mastered, ruled, dominated by nothing but Christ. So he's going to say just one chapter later in 1 Corinthians 7:22 that only the Lord Christ has mastery over him. So before I do anything with my life, I have to look at it and I have to evaluate, will this lead to me being dominated by something? Will this lead to an addiction? Will this lead to something that controls me, that forces me to lie, that forces me to do things that I don't want to do, that takes me places I don't want to go? And guys, look, if any of you in this room, and I'm assuming that a lot of you in this room, have experienced sexual sin, you know the unique power it has to dominate you, like a puppet master controlling a puppet. This is why we can't, look, every now and then I talk with a young guy who will say something like, hey, I'm a teenage guy. Isn't it normal for us to look at porn? Isn't it normal for us to fool around with girls this way, to talk this way? We're just a regular, red-blooded, healthy American guy, right? This is normal. No. Look, I swear to you, the last thing I'm trying to do is to shame anybody in this room. But we need to call sin sin. Sin is not normal. Sin is an alien infection that was never intended to be there. And any sexual experience we have outside of God's design of one man, one woman, under the banner of marriage is sin. And it's trying to kill you. We don't play with this. We don't give it nice-sounding names. We kill it when we find it. We need limits. Now, maybe if you're not a Christian in here today, or maybe you are a Christian, but you wrestle with this seriously. Maybe the thing that you have pop up in your head is, come on, Mark, really? Why is it every time I have to talk to a Christian, or I talk to you, or talk to someone else, it seems like you're always trying to just puncture my fun? What's so wrong with me just doing what makes me feel happy? Is that bad? Is that wrong? There's a lot of people who leave the church because of that, right? Who walk away from the Lord. They just want to live their life. Maybe right now you're teetering on the edge of that, where you honestly have been weighing the scales of what has a better payout. Now, do Christians hate sex? Do Christians hate joy? Do we hate fulfillment? Are we just a bunch of, we eat our granola plain, we gravel our teeth, we buckle down and we do it? Is that what we are? Well, no. In fact, I'm going to make the exact opposite argument. I'm going to say that Christians are not the ones who have too low of a view of sex, but the world does. Or as C.S. Lewis famously said, the Lord does not find our desires too strong, but too weak. Here's what I mean by that. The way our world defines happiness today is in the definition of absolute freedom, especially when we're talking about sex, sexuality, and even what kind of gender we define ourselves as. We think that the apex of freedom is being able to do whatever I want, whenever I want. especially sexually. If I feel an urge, I feel a desire, boom, I act on it because that's what happiness is. Now, the problem with that, and that sounds good, I'm assuming a lot of people do it for a reason, right? The problem with that is that if I have an assumption, I think that this thing will make me most happy, if I'm wrong, then I have to suffer dearly. Let me give you an example. Let's say, imagine I think that what would make me most happy is to do nothing but eat fast food for the rest of my life. Now, that would be nice. You know, it makes me happy, tastes good, and I don't see immediate consequences. You know, all these people talking about a heart attack or obesity. I don't see that. I've been eating fast food for a week now. I'm feeling great. Now, is that going to lead me to a fully orbed, happy life? Is that going to lead to the most fulfilled life that I could have? Well, no. It's going to lead me to a hospital in a couple years because my body was not designed to eat high fructose corn syrup and chemically altered meat-like substances. It wasn't made to run on that. Maybe every now and then is okay, all right? But definitely not regularly. My body will begin to break down. Let's try and tweak our definition of happiness. How about this instead? Happiness is living according to the way I was designed. Happiness is living my life according to the way I was designed. True happiness isn't found in bucking off every possible limitation I see. True happiness is found in finding the right limitations that were designed for me and following them. Now, even the word limitation sounds bad. It sounds negative. Immediately, it sounds like less joy, right? But it takes no time for us to think. Nobody would just, in the name of absolute freedom, jump out of an airplane without a parachute. You know, parachute is a kind of limitation, right? You can't move as well. Nobody would say, hey, don't tell me how to live my life. I skydive the way I want to skydive. And they jump out and they have a thrilling couple of minutes. And that's about it. Let's press this with just one more illustration. And I used this before in our talk on dating. Fire is a good thing. You have a fire in your fireplace at home. It makes your home feel comfortable, warm, and inviting. But you take that fire out of the fireplace and you put it on your sofa, put it on your kitchen table. You remove the limitations around it. What was nice and good becomes destructive. That's exactly what sex is like, friends. Sex is a powerful, beautiful, good thing, provided it is used, received, and enjoyed according to its design. You remove those limitations on it, and it will destroy you, even if you do not see the consequences immediately. Now, look, you could disagree with me on this, and hopefully I can convince you by the end of the talk. But what we can say for certain is that a Christian's choice to honor God's design for sex and save it for marriage does not come out of a low view of sex, does not come from an apathetic view of sex, but comes from the highest view of sex there is. We're not just a bunch of monks who sit around and think that sex is dirty and wicked and below us. No, not at all. Friends, look, in light of how careless and flippant the world is with this gift, we're not the ones who care too little about sex, okay? They are. When we buck God's designs, we're saying that we want a lesser joy, not higher. Those are the limits. Now, that point is predicated. It's built on what I said earlier about this idea that we need to submit to a design. And we've talked about the design some, but let's look more specifically, and that's what Paul's going to get into next. This is verse 13. Again, he's going to quote the Corinthians. Food is meant for the stomach, and stomach for the food, and God will destroy both one and the other. Pause. Okay. Paul is correcting another error they have, and it's twofold. They think that sex is essentially an appetite. If you're hungry, you eat. If you're horny, you have sex. It's just another appetite you have. It's a craving. And your body is going to be destroyed one day, so it doesn't really matter what you do with it. You only live once, as Drake told us. So just live it up. Do as much as you can. Have as much sex as possible. Who cares? You're going to die. Now, as much as it feels like that might be true, Paul drives at the original design for the body. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord. And the Lord is for the body. God is for your body. He's not against you. He is for you. And your body is for him. Look, what does Paul mean when he says that your body is for the Lord? Well, he's going way back to the very beginning. So Paul typically does. Go back to the very beginning, the initial design. In Genesis 1, we're told that we are made in the image of God. We are made to reflect God. That's why you exist. If you have ever wondered why you exist, you don't need to wonder anymore. This is it. You are made like a mirror, and a mirror reflects what it beholds. You're made to behold God, to look at him, to see him, to savor him, to treasure him, to worship him, to see him as most supreme in your life. And when you behold him, you reflect what he's like, his character, his nature, his actions, his heart. It's reflected in you so that at any moment, someone should be able to look at you and what you do with your body, what you do with your time, what you do with your money, and see a reflection of God. That is what your body was given to you for. That is the reason you were made. That is the reason you exist. Your body is not made for sin, but for the Lord. Now, here is, and I've already alluded to this. Whenever Paul is talking about what we're doing with our bodies, he's using body as a metonymy for sex, for what we're doing sexually with our bodies. So, when he's saying that your body is for the Lord, he is explicitly meaning your sex lives and your sexual actions are for God. And that, if you're listening, that sounds kind of weird, okay? But that's okay. Just stick with me. Trust me, it's going to get weirder as we get along. So just take it in stride, okay? Here's the purpose of sex. The overarching purpose of sex is to be used, received, and enjoyed in such a way that brings glory to God. That is the purpose of sex. Everything else is subordinate to it. Now look, there are a whole bunch of other reasons or purposes for sex. I mean, sex is given to us for pleasure. I swear to you, there are Bible verses in Scripture that if I were to read aloud would make you blush and cause your parents to be angry that I read them in church. The Bible does not pull any punches about the sexually explicit nature of pleasure in sex. That's a good thing. God made sex to be enjoyed, okay? It's not just a way for you to have children. It's given for pleasure. It's given for procreation, for having children. It's given for comfort. It's given for protection, for husbands and wives to protect each other from lustful temptation. And it's given for consummating marriages. We'll talk about that later. All of these, however, sit under the overarching banner of the great design of being the glory of God being displayed in your sex lives. That's why it was given to you. That's the purpose of sex. Now here's what Paul's done. He's put a fence up around sex, and he's lifted up the general concept, the purpose of sex, but now he's going to take all of this kind of theoretical theology, and he's going to bring it crashing down into earth with a real flesh live example. And just as an aside, Your theology should change your sex life. What you believe about God and the Bible should change what you do late at night when you're on the internet and no one else is around. What you believe about Christ should change how you talk to women, how you treat women, how you pursue dating, how you think about marriage. Your theology should change that. Not remain in this Ziploc bag in your mind that you pull out every Sunday or every now and then to have conversations. It is to be a seed that is dropped into your soul that grows and shapes everything. It did for Paul, and it should for us. Okay, here's Paul's scenario. The Corinthians are sleeping with prostitutes. It's the modern day equivalent of looking at porn. They didn't have pornography back then, but they had prostitutes and a lot of them. And it was just, hey, we're red-blooded American guys, so we look at naked pictures of women. And they were red-blooded Corinthian guys, so they had sex with prostitutes. It was culturally acceptable. And so it's crazy to us, but it's sin is sin, and it takes different forms. So, Paul is outraged, understandably so, that they are sleeping with prostitutes. Which is, he should be outraged, probably, right? Yeah, so here's what Paul says. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. Now, notice what Paul doesn't do here. Paul does not just go back to Leviticus and Deuteronomy and say, hey, Leviticus 18 says don't commit sexual immorality. Stupid, what are you doing? Dumb Corinthians. The Bible says don't do this, you're doing it. That's dumb. He could have said that. And I could do that up here right now. I could say, hey, don't look at porn, don't masturbate, don't fool around with girls, don't do all, I could do that. But Paul doesn't. And that's why I'm not. What Paul does, he doesn't do less than that, but he does more. He goes back to the original design and power that sex has. And he's trying to create a sense of reverence and awe in the listeners for the sacredness of sex. So notice Paul goes back to Genesis 2:24, and he looks at the power of sex is that it brings these two people together in one flesh. But notice the difference when he's talking about what happens when you sleep with a prostitute. What happens? What happens? What does it say? Become one what? That's not what it says. What does it say? Come on. One body. Why did Paul say that? Did he mean one flesh? No. I didn't catch this, honestly, until I was just studying this last week. This kind of cut my feet out from under me. When you have sex with someone who's not your wife, a mini marriage doesn't suddenly happen. You're not suddenly like, oh, whoa, now we're married in the eyes of God, so I guess we should just keep having sex. No, Paul says that when you have sex with someone who is not your spouse, you become one body. It's not the same word. It's like it's this mockery of the one flesh. The word flesh doesn't just mean like a physical body. The word for flesh is the Greek word sarx, and it refers to the whole person. It's a personhood, not just from your toes to the top of your head. When God's design was created for sex, it was meant to be a union of two persons. When you take sex and you have it with someone who is not your spouse, you just have two bodies coming together. And there is a union. There is some sort of bonding. There's one body there. But it's this Frankenstein grotesque mockery of what it is meant to be. Paul is outraged, not because they're sleeping with prostitutes, because, ew, prostitutes. He's outraged because of the sacredness of sex. Let's look a little bit more clearly at what one flesh means. The one flesh union of a husband and wife, what we see in Genesis, does not just mean the physical closeness and intimacy of sexual union. Like these two bodies are close together. That's not what one flesh means. One flesh means the intermingling of two persons into one new person together. And this, in Genesis 2, this is at their wedding. This is their marriage. One flesh is that every aspect of your life has been brought together emotionally, spiritually, physically, sexually, financially, legally. Every aspect of you has been brought together as one. And the sexual act of consummation, having sex after you have just become married, is meant to be the capstone on the whole life brought together. It's the final flowering of the entire marriage coming together. It is the final note in the song of marriage. That is what a one flesh union is. You can't have sexual union with someone that you don't have whole life union with. When the final note is severed from the rest of the song, what could be sweeping, beautiful, and moving becomes flat, pointless, and stupid. When you take sex outside of what it's designed, you hurt yourself, and you lose the beauty of what it could be. Sex is not just something you do with your body, like working out. It is deeply emotional, spiritual, and whole life encompassing. Look, imagine sex as, sex is like the fusion that happens when two plates of metal are brought together for welding. You have two plates of metal, you put them together, and the more and more that they are perfectly lined up, and a welder comes in and he fuses them together, it's going to be a really strong connection, right? It's going to be almost inseparable to pull those plates apart. But you take the same two plates and you just let them touch at the corners, and the welder comes and he fuses them together. There's a connection. But it will break under any amount of weight. And though it breaks, it will still rip and tear the metal. When let's move on to the next one. I'm gonna jump into something too long there. Here's the idea. Sex is meant to be reserved for marriage, not just from a biblical perspective, but from modern science today. I read a book called Hooked, and it was about how sex affects our brains, and it gave us these 3 neurochemicals. And if you want to know more about this, you can ask in the Q&A. Dopamine is the reward chemical in your brain that is released when you do something that's pleasurable. And these other 2, oxytocin and vasopressin, are what are called the bonding agents in your mind. Oxytocin is primarily for women, vasopressin for men. When you have any kind of meaningful physical contact with another person, your brain begins to release vasopressin. And it literally rewires the synapses in your brain to attach you to that person. And look, guys, that does not have to be necessarily sexual contact. If you hug someone for 20 seconds or more, your brain begins to release vasopressin. I was talking with middle schoolers about this last week, and one of them came up to me and said, "Is that what happens like when I hug my mom?" Yeah, that's exactly what happens. It's made to connect you. Now, there is nothing you can do more in life to release vasopressin than have sex, or become sexually aroused, stimulated. Nothing releases that more highly than that. Now, here's the dangerous thing. If you become connected powerfully to someone because you have sex with them, the truth is that you're probably going to stay in that relationship longer than maybe you should. You're going to feel like it's impossible to break it off because your brain has glued you to that person. And the only way you can break it is with an incredible amount of pain. And when you do that, you actually damage the part of your brain that's responsible for creating that chemical. And the next time you go and have sex with someone, your brain will create a lower amount of vasopressin. So here's what I'm saying. Don't buy what the culture is telling you. You listen to most music, watch movies or TV shows, the culture tells you that the best sex there is the guy who's just, he's just neck deep in women who just want him, right? Like that's it. Yeah, those are the guys who are really living it up and enjoying it. No, they're not. They actually have so damaged their brain that the only thing that they can enjoy in sex now is the dopamine rush. It's the orgasm. And look, most of you in here, except for our leaders, you're not married, so you don't know what this means at all. But I swear to you, sex is so much more than just getting an orgasm. If you reduce sex just to that, you lose everything with it. Sex is so much more than that. And you take a piece of tape and you stick it to something, you pull it off, stick it to something else, you pull it off, stick it onto something else, pull it off. You just do that over and over and over again. What happens to the tape? It doesn't stick to anything anymore. That's what happens to our brain when we have sex with different people, when we masturbate to pornography. We are damaging our brains and cutting the joy out of sex. So don't buy the cultural story, okay? They're bragging about Lunchable crackers when you can have a fine steak. Don't take the counterfeit. Have the real thing. Okay, there are limits to sex. There's a purpose to sex. And there is great power in sex. But there's a problem. Truthfully, most of us in this room have deviated from that design already. I would be willing to bet that most of you in this room have sinned or been sinned against sexually. Most likely multiple times, if not already an addictive pattern in your life. I spent my teenage years hopelessly addicted to pornography. It started when I was a really young guy, found a dirty magazine under my dad's bed, and it just went from there. I became a Christian when I was a freshman in high school, and I hated what I did. I hated it. I hated myself. I hated it. I'd contemplate suicide after just giving into this. I felt so sick and twisted inside. But no matter what I did, no matter how many books I read, no matter how many people I confessed to, no matter what happened, it was still there. Now, there was eventually a point where I just started thinking, I had the thought come to mind that, hey, you know what, maybe this will just stay around with me until I have sex. Like you stay hungry until you eat food. I was buying into that lie. But then I started to make friends with people who are older than me who were married. And I found that many of them still were addicted to pornography. And they were having sex. And so I said, that obviously doesn't fix the problem. And look, I did not have any freedom from the bondage of an idolatrous relationship to sex until I learned two things. And that is the understanding of the end of sex and the overwhelming love of God. And I want to talk about those last two things with you now with the rest of our time. The end of sex and the overwhelming, experiencing the overwhelming love of God. So the end of sex, what do I mean by that? When I was young, there was a popular Christian book series going around that was all about like the end of the world and Christ coming again and, tribulation stuff. And I had just become a Christian, and these books were everywhere. My parents weren't Christians, and my parents were reading them. And I didn't really like them that much, but I would still, every now and then, I would find myself secretly praying, God, please don't come back yet, because I don't want to die a virgin. I don't want to die and not have sex. I want to have sex. Can you please make that? If you're going to come, give me like a 30-minute warning, and I can go get married really fast. And in my mind, having sex was ultimate, right? Now, there's this really troubling and upsetting teaching in Matthew 20 where Jesus instructs us that in heaven, there's no such thing as marriage. Matthew 22:30, Jesus says that in heaven we will not be married or given in marriage. Therefore, there'll be no sex in heaven. And that troubled me. Why would there be no sex? Why would there be no marriage? Aren't those good things? Why would they be gone? Well, they are good things, absolutely, but they are not ultimate things. In fact, look at this interesting thing, if interesting, if not troubling thing that Paul says next in 1 Corinthians 6. Here's what he says. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Therefore, flee sexual immorality. Okay, so whatever that means, it is supposed to motivate you in such a way that you are running away from sexual temptation. What does that mean? Well, here, it actually is more shocking when we compare it with what he just said. Verse 16. He who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her. Verse 17, he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Okay, so let's look at this. What are the similarities there? Okay, they're both joined. It's the same word there, and they both become one. But the difference is that he's talking about being joined to a prostitute and becoming one body, or being joined to the Lord and becoming one spirit. This is shocking. And I thought about, maybe this is just too weird to share with young guys. Maybe this will just, but this is God's word. And this, I swear to you, will alleviate an incredible amount of difficulties. Here's what Paul is saying simply. That being sexually joined to a prostitute is comparable to being spiritually joined to the Lord. Paul is saying in the same way that you give yourselves wholly over to a prostitute, that's okay, you can look like that, Miles, it's weird, it's okay. The way that you give yourself wholly over to this other person in the throes of passion, you give yourself over to spiritually to the Lord. And what Paul is drawing from this conclusion is, don't be united to a prostitute, be united to the Lord. Don't put your eggs in the basket of something that's temporary, like a body. Put your eggs in the basket of what's eternal, the Spirit, and be joined to Him. Simply, here's what Paul's saying. He's showing the ultimate purpose, the end of sex. A picture of God's love and connection with us. That is the purpose of sex. Sex is about God. Sex is for God. Now, Paul is outraged that they're sleeping with prostitutes, but it's not because prostitutes are gross. It's because sex is so sacred. Look, in Paul's letter to Ephesians, he plays this out even more. Here's what Paul says to his Ephesian church. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Does that sound familiar? What's Paul quoting? Genesis 2:24. It's what we opened with, God's design for sex. The two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Do you see what Paul's saying? He's saying that the marriage that we have recorded in Genesis 2:24 is only a shadow of what the real marriage is. Adam and Eve holding and cleaving onto another is there just as a signpost to point us to the true marriage, Christ and his bride, the church, us. Do you know who you are, Christian? You are his. And sex was given to us to relate and communicate the nature of God's own self-giving love for us. Now, in Genesis 2:25, then, when we see that this concept of man and woman being both naked and not ashamed, that then has a deeper meaning. Now, when it's talking about being naked here, it's not just talking about nudity. It's talking, Adam and Eve, they're naked and unashamed, is that there's nothing hidden from one another. Everything in their life, all of their thoughts, all of their desires, all of their actions is just out there in the open, and there's no shame. Which, when we interact with other people, we're constantly trying to conceal all that garbage, right? We'll let people see maybe, this much of our life. We'll let them see the good parts. And Adam and Eve were able to say, no, everything in my life you have free right to see. And I experience no shame in that. Paul is saying that is meant to be a symbol to the deeper reality of what God's union is intended to be with us. Complete vulnerability, complete transparency, complete intimacy with no shame, fully known and fully loved at the same time. This is the end of sex. I'm using that word with a bit of a double entendre on it. The end, the purpose, and the conclusion of sex. It is a window to God's own love and desire and union with us. The joy that we are longing for and have come to believe is hidden in sex isn't there. It was never in sex. Sex was only the vehicle by which it came through. And what came through was a longing for God, our true spouse. A longing to have full Genesis 2:25 union with him. Friends, someday you will have that relationship with God. And you will not need sex anymore. In heaven, there will be no sex because we won't need the metaphor any longer. There will be no marriage. There'll be no husbands and wives. The bride will be issued in to meet the husband. Revelation 19 kicks off the new creation with a wedding party, the wedding feast of the Lamb, and the bride, the church, approaches. That's us. That's our story. Look, there will be a day when there will be no more sex. We won't need it in the same way a soldier who has returned home will not need the wrinkled photograph of his wife because he has her in his arms. We won't need a metaphor, we'll have the real thing. Friends, if you can learn that truth, it will save you from 1,000 problems in your life. Sex is not ultimate. Sex will not fix you. Sex will not heal you. Sex will not redeem you. Sex will not fill you. Sex will not define you. Sex can give you none of those things because the purpose of sex is to connect you to the one thing that can do all of those things, Christ. And if you're sitting in here just holding out, just waiting for the day I can have sex someday and then finally everything will be better, it won't come. You'll be frustrated and disappointed, and like the rest of our world, you're going to be like a dog chasing its tail, constantly looking for different ways to have sex because you thought you were going to have it in this thing, and you got there, and it wasn't there. It was never supposed to be there. It came through it. It's a window. You look through it to see what you're actually trying to see. God. That is what sex has been given to you for. So, now in this season where you're not married, you can abstain. You cannot do it. Because sex was never the point. God is. Look, Jesus Christ is the most perfect man who ever lived, and he never had sex. You could all die tomorrow, virgins, and you'd be fine. That is the end of sex. Sex is about God. Sex is not God. Lastly, experiencing the overwhelming love of God. If we're honest with ourselves, as great as all of that sounds, the reality of standing before God, utterly transparent, utterly exposed, sounds horrifying, right? The thought of every desire, every thought, every word, every action I've ever committed, thought, felt, being held out there in I can't do anything to control it. It's just there. He sees everything. That sounds like our worst nightmare. And actually, the focus on sex and sexual sin, what we're talking about tonight, is really fitting because one of the most commonly used metaphors for sin in the Bible is adultery. I'm not talking about the sin of adultery itself. I'm talking about how in the Bible, God uses metaphors to describe sin, like adultery and prostitution, believe it or not. You read any of the prophets, God constantly is coming to his people and saying, why are you cheating on me? Why are you giving yourself away like a whore to these other lovers? Look, here's an assignment for you. Read Ezekiel 16 this week, tonight. Read Ezekiel 16. It is a powerful story. It's unsettling. The long and short of that is that God shows mercy on us and saves us and turns us into his bride, though we did not deserve it. And in return, we take all of his riches and we leave him and we turn ourselves into a whore. But we're not a normal prostitute. We actually become a reverse prostitute, and we pay other people to take advantage of us. That's gross. That's grotesque. It's supposed to be. And we actually, at the end of the chapter, are left empty, alone, sad, crushed, and up to our eyeballs in debt racked up from our spiritual adultery. Now, when we sin, look, friends, when we sin, whether it's sexual sin or any other kind of sin, we're not breaking a rule. We're breaking a person's heart. I know that sounds super cliche, but some of you have experienced that in your parents' marriage, okay? You've seen the effects of what it's like for a spouse to leave a spouse and go throw themselves into the arms of another. You've seen that maybe in your parents' marriage or your friend's marriage. There's nothing more devastating than that. When we sin, we're not just, messed up again. We're throwing ourselves into the arms of another lover, turning ourselves into a prostitute. Now, the reason why this is good news, and I'm bringing you really down low at the end here, is that Paul ends his teaching with this. You are not your own. You were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. What does Paul mean by this? You see this all over the place. I saw this on a flyer somewhere in town, and it was like they were trying to talk about why we need to exercise, because glorify God in your body. That's not what this means. This doesn't mean that you need to exercise. Remember, when he's talking about body, he's talking about what you do sexually. Paul only uses the phrase, you are bought with a price, one other place in everything he's written. And it's one chapter later in 1 Corinthians 7. And it's when he's explaining to the Corinthians that they need to not give themselves over and make themselves into slaves of other men because they were bought with a price and have now become slaves of God, and in that slavery have found freedom. You get the image is that you and I were slaves on an auction block, and God walked in and said, I want that one. I will purchase, money down, that slave. But he doesn't do it to exploit us. He brings us out and says, you're free. And overwhelmed by genuine love, we drop down on our knees and we say, I will serve you for the rest of my life. The same thing is happening here. Paul is saying that when we have sex with a prostitute, we somehow become a prostitute. You become one body with her. When we give ourselves over to our sexual sin, we literally and sadly and ironically are prostituting ourselves out. And Paul is saying you were bought with a price. The image is that Jesus, King of the universe, Son of God, perfect in all his ways, walks into the brothel. And he looks at a prostitute and says, I want to buy that prostitute. Whatever it costs, money down, I want that prostitute. But he doesn't do it to exploit us, to take advantage of us, like every other God has, like every other hope has. He does it to free us. And in our great, tremendous, genuine love, we fall down on our knees and say, I love you. Now, in that moment, what he could do is say, you're a whore. You know who I am? Is that what he says to us? No. The scandal of the Bible, and guys, look, this isn't just weird Mark stuff. This is all over the Bible. This is one of the main themes of the Bible. The great scandal of the Bible is that the Son of God does not find his bride in the palaces or the universities or the beauty pageants, but at the whorehouse. And he does not choose her because she is beautiful, but he chooses her and loves her in such a way that makes her beautiful. You will one day stand before God. In Genesis 2:25, you will be naked and unashamed. All of your sexual sin will be out there. All of your failures will be out there for him to see. But you won't experience shame because Jesus Christ went up onto a cross at Golgotha, and he took your sin on his back, and he paid the debt so that you could have your shame covered and forgiven and healed, and so that you now can be dressed in the white robes of righteousness. That is the love of God. That is this unbelievable, he knows you fully down to the bottom, but he loves you completely. Look, okay, last thing. That's what you're looking for in the sheets of a prostitute or at the websites of porn. What you're looking for in a girlfriend, what you're looking for in some girl you can manipulate emotionally, you're looking for just a shred of, I want to be known and loved. But by definition, any sex outside of God's design is to be only partially known and therefore partially loved. Only in the gospel of Jesus Christ can you be fully known, fully loved by the true spouse who will give you what your heart longs for most, God. That's the gospel. And that is the power that you need to break the chains of your sexual addiction, of your sexual pattern, of your sin, to not just capitulate to the world. So look, be encouraged. If you're a sexual sinner, and we all are in here, Christ has paid your debt. Be encouraged. If you're a sexual sinner, you have something now more beautiful and sweet and alluring than your sin that can win the allegiance of your heart. Be encouraged. God has given you the gift of sex to be enjoyed and used so that you might know him more clearly. Let's pray. Lord, we want to know you. We want to honor you. Would you help us experience that love? Would you help us see the purpose of sex? Would you help us see the power of sex? Lord, would you help us? Lord, to pray for anyone in this room who is addicted and in chains. Would you now, by the power of your Spirit working through your gospel, sever those chains? Would you give them what their heart is really looking for? Intimacy and union with you. Lord, help these men. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.